Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to join us in the virtual version of City Arts and Lectures at San Francisco's magical and amazing Sidney Goldstein Theater, where we hope to see you in person before long. So I'm here with writer, actor, director Brit Marling, one of the most brilliant and amazing people I know, and I am so excited to talk to her. I'm so grateful to all of you who showed up, and I'm so happy to be with City Arts and Lectures again. So welcome and thank you, and hello, Brit. How are you?
Hi, Rebecca. How are you? How are you doing in this time right now? How are you finding yourself?
I am searching for the phrase we can all use who are in my situation, which is the sense of personally fine, deeply distressed and preoccupied by all the people who aren't. And we're here in our homes and our livings go on, our homes are comfortable. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a terrifying and difficult time for so many people facing financial free fall and the collapse of the economy, unemployment, people who aren't in comfortable homes, who have no homes or have abusive partners, or just difficult situations. And there are just so many different situations people are in now, and so many of them are so difficult. So I want to acknowledge all the people in those situations, and I don't know if we can dedicate this to them. I wrote about other kinds of difficulty in the book we came to discuss originally. And speaking of that, I kind of one of the things I wanted to ask you, Britt, first, how are you? And second of all, is what's going on right now season 3 of the OA?
Oh my goodness. I am okay. I think I'm having a similar experience to you, which is that as a writer, I am often in a way just at home. But simultaneously trying to process this experience we're all collectively inside. You know, I saw on Instagram somebody posted an image of a graffiti work that said, Corona is the virus, capitalism is the pandemic. And I saw that and it was kind of just like, doesn't that say everything? That this experience is kind of just revealing how many things within our system are broken and how many people are made so vulnerable and have no safety net. So it's a challenging thing, like you're saying, to navigate, trying to figure out how to be of use in that way while also being stuck at home. And I think the thing it's done the most for me is it puts a kind of pressure on the writing to really think about not like, what story do I want to tell next, or what am I liking or what am I into? It's more like, what story must I tell? Like, what stories can be useful now and going forward? And it's funny that you bring up the OA, actually, because I don't know if you know this, but Ryan Heffington, the choreographer who created the brilliant movements that were in the show, he's been doing these fantastic live dancing sort of tutorials on Instagram Live. And people all over the world who never thought they would find themselves dancing and moving in new ways before are in their living rooms or their kitchens or their bedrooms, with their phones on, learning to move their bodies and move in strange ways and even embarrass themselves but sweat and have fun and let go. And I think it's really interesting because I think it's a moment when we're seeing new responses to trauma, like the realization that part of recovering from trauma, healing from trauma, might be about moving through it, embodying it, and letting it go as much as it is about thinking or talking through it. And I think that's really what the OA as a narrative was all about, was trying to look at these more feminine technologies like movement and think about how we can use them as survival skills. But what's interesting for me is that your book, Recollections of My Nonexistence, has been my deep companion during this time. I've been reading it slowly and savoring it. And for me, I found so many tools in here for navigating this moment. One of the major tools that I found was just collective, the power of the collective. You talk so much in this book about being interested in a group of artists and then going to meet them and following them and then finding safety in a tribe and learning how to blossom yourself as an artist inside, that cocoon, or your brother's work as an activist drawing you out to the Nevada test site and finding a collective of activists there, and how much was possible when groups of people came together. And you write so much about that in all of your work. That brilliant essay you wrote for LitHub about abandoning the myth of the singular hero and thinking about what people can achieve together. And that seems like such a useful message to me at this point in time. I wonder if you could just talk a bit about that and about how it plays such a strong role in the recounting of your life and your journey to making art.
What a great place to start. Thank you so much. There's a wonderful climate activist in Fiji who said to me, as we're talking about mutual aid and its many manifestations in this crisis, she said, the way we get through this is together. And I loved it. And then somebody posted something I said so that I saw it and was reminded of it yesterday, that for years and years we were told that human response to danger is fight or flight, but there's actually a feminine response, which I think the OA is all about, which is the third way, tend and befriend. And how people have tended and befriended in this time when we cannot be physically together for the most part has been fascinating and moving and profound. You have your friend doing dance. My friend Wendy McNaughton is doing drawing classes for kids. But I've seen just so much important and creative stuff. And maybe I'll give an example. I've fallen in love with a group called the Anti-Sewing Squad, started by LA performance artist Christina Wong, which is now more than 500 people, mostly women of color, who just set out to produce masks for frontline and vulnerable communities, and have produced more than 20,000 masks, have this wonderful decentered kind of horizontal organizing system to meet the needs of communities. They're sending 3 Serger sewing machines and a ton of masks to the Navajo Nation this weekend. Wow. And just doing so much amazing stuff. And a few of them didn't know how to sew. Most of them had kind of dusty sewing machines in the closet. And they just set out to make this a less unequal situation by providing masks for people who needed them and weren't going to get them. And there's just so much stuff like that that's so incredible. And of course, the greed and selfishness of the powerful is also on display. I wrote another book about it. I have here for other moments, A Paradise Built in Hell, which is exactly about how civil society meets the moment of disaster with generosity, improvisation, solidarity. But Recollections is also about that in a way. In a lot of ways, I was a deeply solitary, isolated kid. I was, from abuse and other things, just deeply withdrawn, and also just an introvert in love with books. But this was a book both about the interior world of reading and writing, but also learning from the communities around me. It begins when I'm 19. I move into the Black community of the Western Addition at the invitation of a wonderful old building manager who invited me to move into his building. First white person there in 17 years in 1981. And what I learned from that community, what I learned from the gay community that was a short walk away in the Castro district, what I learned from the Western Shoshone and Native land rights movement I joined in the early 90s. And, and so it really is about learning from the communities around me and how we liberate each other, even when we're not in the same category. I learned I am tragically straight, but I learned so much from gay men in particular, but lesbians and trans people as well, growing up in this wonderfully queer city. And they gave me this liberatory sense that if they can reject the rules of gender and find it worthwhile to face the consequences, then I can too. And I think feminism at its best has always been implicitly and often explicitly queer positive, and queer rights have always been feminist in re-evaluating what masculinity is and what the hierarchy is. And so those things were so much part of growing up. And I did join groups, notably activist groups, that were some of the first communities I felt safe and at home in. And and ultimately, the victory in this book isn't that I became a writer and wrote a lot of books. It's that a feminist movement gave me the conversation I so yearned for when I was a young woman facing menace and harassment, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And then really, I feel what happened in 2012 or 13 is we began to talk about violence, from workplace sexual harassment and campus rape to domestic violence to street harassment to femicide, in ways that had an impact that they never quite had before. And that feels revolutionary to me. And part of why I'm so happy to be talking to you and asked for you to be part of this event is because it's something you've addressed in so many ways in the OA and other movie projects you've taken on, and in some of the things you wrote at the beginning of Me Too. And so thank you for that.
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, thank you for, you talk in this book a lot about that it's not just about having a voice, but then being met with the feeling of credibility, that your voice is credible, that somebody should listen. And you gave me that so much before I knew you. Just in reading your work, I felt this sense of, you can write elliptically, you call it hopscotch in this book, which I love. The idea of advancing forward in a narrative and then going back to the beginning and retracing your steps deeper, learning more, trying something else, going a little further. And I remember when I first read A Field Guide to Getting Lost, I was like, I didn't know you could write like this. And it moved me and informed my writing. And then later when we knew one another and you encouraged me to keep writing nonfiction, that was huge for me. I mean, I think I felt, and you talk a lot in this book about the struggle of doubt, of, in some ways, this book tells the story of a woman finding her voice and becoming an artist, but it can't tell that story without telling the companion tale of a woman just surviving, in a culture that wants to annihilate her, with her sanity and her body and her imagination intact and not fractured, and then trying to make art from that place. And so you really gave me so much of that sense of hope, first in your work and then just in your encouragement to keep writing nonfiction, and that my voice could be credible and that I did have something worth saying. And those things were all so hard to find in the beginning of my career, and are still sometimes hard to find. And I wonder if you would talk a bit about that. When you set out to write this memoir, did you realize how much of it was going to be about that twinned journey of both coming of age as an artist, but then how much of that is also just about surviving and the threat against your body? Did you know when you thought, I'm going to write this memoir, did you know that would be its nature or structure, or was that a surprise as you were revisiting your experience as a young woman?
It really felt like that was the story. I set out really around 19 was when I really began to write in earnest. I decided to be a writer when I learned how to read in first grade, but I didn't write much outside school assignments. But, at 19, it was time to get real about it. And it was also the point at which I realized the street harassment and menace that had been around me for a while. Maybe it was because I opened up a little bit, because I was such a shut down person, one of those people who kind of goes catatonic to survive trauma as a child. Mm-hmm. Just to be surrounded by the reality that men wanted to harm me, maybe unto death, in hideous and degrading and intrusive ways, and that was entertainment, and it was in Hitchcock and David Lynch and everybody else, and it was in pop songs. And I was a young woman when the Rolling Stones advertised their Black and Blue album with a bruised woman tied to a chair saying, I'm black and blue from the Rolling Stones and I love it. And that was billboards and advertisements everywhere. And there was just this atmosphere, and still is everywhere, of people glorying and gloating in the destruction and humiliation of women. It's what drives a lot of mainstream straight porn. And nobody was talking about it. So of course that was something I had to contend with, both in terms of just surviving when I walked down the street and in what it does to your consciousness. And I wanted to write this book because I've been writing about feminism really since 1985, when I did a cover story for a punk rock magazine about violence against women. My preoccupation has a history. But I also felt that I'd been writing about it in a kind of objective editorial way and a reportorial way, and those things were useful, putting things in context, talking about statistics and general patterns. But what I'd missed in all that is what it does to you, because in those early years, I had pretty much classic PTSD symptoms. I was hypervigilant, I had intrusive thoughts, I was so anxious and tense, and it really impacted me. But also what we don't talk about is this is not just violence against the body, it's specifically violence against the voice. And we so often talk about voices like it's just the capacity to make a noise, which we share with animals and squeak toys and blenders and washing machines. But what it really is not something that's inherent in yourself, because we often say like, oh, she was voiceless, and almost nobody is truly voiceless. People often don't use their voice because they know the punishment for it or the refusal to hear and believe would make it pointless or worse than pointless to speak. And so I wanted to write also about that voicelessness, because that was part of my experience of violence against women, was that things kept happening to me and to women around me, and nobody took it seriously. I recount in this book a number of experiences where people essentially told me that they didn't believe me, it didn't happen. My essay Men Explain Things to Me, whose creation and consequences I recount in this, was really about what happens when you don't have a voice, when you say something happened and somebody says you are not competent, to speak. And that's really annoying when it's your professional expertise, whether it's filmmaking or microbiology or medicine or astronomy or, plumbing for that matter. But when you say, as somebody does in that essay, my husband is trying to kill me, and people think that you're just, to use the grossest stereotype about women in distress, you're crazy. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, is so much what the OA is about, unbelievability. That lack of voice becomes something that can cause your death. And actually, early in the book, I quote this passage from you when you wrote early in the Me Too era, which was not a whole new thing. It was just another chapter in the long book of feminism. But you wrote an essay about encounters with Harvey Weinstein. And what was so compelling about those things when he finally went to jail, something I don't think we ever thought was going to happen, was realizing everything he did to women and tried to do to you banked upon an inequality of voices, that women would not be able to speak up because people wouldn't believe them, because he could render punishments that would make it not worth it to them, that he could terrorize them, that we had a whole society that had been discrediting women's stories since Freud decided to deny his patients' experience of being molested by their fathers, and long before. So everything Harvey Weinstein did banked on an inequality of voices, the opposite of a democracy of voices. And you had a direct experience of that. And I wonder if you want to talk about your own trying to be an artist, trying to have a voice in, something even worse than the publishing industry, which I snark about a fair bit, the film industry, and maybe something about that essay. Your audition for, was it Bikini Girl number 2 and Blonde number 3 and things like that?
I think in the beginning, you just have this deep desire to create, and probably that comes from the place of an instinct to heal yourself from trauma. Like when you were just describing now the feeling a constant sense of anxiety, I was thinking about how, as a younger woman, and still now, if I'm in a new space, a new hotel room or a new house, I still do this thing where I think about what are all the exits? Like, what are all the ways I can run if I have to run? If I'm on the second floor, is there like a drain pipe I can slide down? Which is an absurd preoccupation. And I used to think, I'm just sort of crazy that I do this. But when I started talking with other women about it, it's like a lot of women actually plan these kind of escape scenarios, even much later in life when they're not in really any imminent danger, and that is taxing and has a weight on you. And I think the journey towards wanting to be an actress or be a writer and a filmmaker and a storyteller was about trying to eviscerate that trauma and heal from that trauma. And in the beginning, of course, you're met with, the opposite of that sort of pure intentions behind that pursuit. You're auditioning in this town for roles, and you're being slotted into narratives that are just continuing to perpetuate the status quo that is a kind of annihilation against women. You have this amazing line in here that I just kept returning to over and over again, where you talk about the idea of thinking through stories and deciding what will actually serve you. Let me see if I can find it. I know I'm just reading you back to you, but
I'll take it.
It was really a profound moment for me because it kind of coalesced. You said, becoming a writer formalizes the task that faces us all in making a life, to become conscious of what the overarching stories are and whether or not they serve you, and how to compose versions with room for who you are and what you value. Oh my, drop the mic, drop the book. To me, it's like I read that sentence and I was like, that's it. To me, that's everything. I think I got to a point in my career where I realized that to survive, I was going to have to abandon all of my values. And then what vessel of any use could I be on the other side of that? I would have broken my soul. And so it became so clear to me that the only way out was to make my own work. And then, quite like you, really the only way to do that, if you're in any oppressed group, is to band together with other people. Zalbat Mongledge, who co-created the OA, who's been my best friend since college, Mike Cahill, who we also met there, John Mulaney was doing comedy at the time, and Nick Kroll. Everybody that met at Georgetown just started making this stuff and then went on to continue making stuff in these collaborative forms. And I think I think you really need a collective, because while the rest of the world is telling you, no, you can't have this part, no, that short film doesn't work, it's too feminine, it's too strange, it's too surreal, it's a surrealism we haven't seen before from a feminized imagination, you need people around you that are saying, no, keep going. And you have been that force for me too. Like, when I wrote the essay about the economics of consent and the experience with Harvey and the systemic underlying causes of that situation, I felt really embarrassed about it and ashamed, and also like I might never work again. But it was your letter to me where you said, no, this matters, keep going. And I then felt in turn from that gift you gave me that I needed to turn around and say to other women around me, no, keep going. This is good, because we have to make each other feel credible and heard before the world will. And so I thought that was another part of the memoir that was so moving to me, was towards the end when it coalesced into the realization that it isn't just about speaking, it isn't just about the auditory experience. It's, does it land? Is it valued? And then is it encouraged? That feels like the main thing is, does the audience say yes and give me more? I mean, I want, you talk in the book about early experiences where people gave you that. Can you say a bit more about what that was like, how necessary the encouragement was, or how it kept you going in times when, so many doors were being shut in your face, or publishers were were not giving you the...
And it's funny, as a young woman, there's the people who are in, particularly for somebody who's older like me, who grew up in a much less feminist era. Not that things are great now, but more women and other people who've absorb feminism and believe in it are in charge of things, of more things and more arenas. But I felt like I had a double existence. I had a lot of female friends and gay friends, and we had these wonderful, deep, long phone conversations. In a way, the best part of the pandemic for me is returning to the kind of phone life I used to have then, when people would just call each other up. Cell phone use is so transactional. It's so, lousy sound quality, distracted people, briefly scheduling, or, imparting data. But we used to have these deep conversations. One of the arguments I sometimes have with my partner comes out of, I think he thinks that language is transactional, that we're either, instructing, arguing, imparting data, etc. And I think it's just connective. And, I wrote an essay in praise of preaching to the choir because the phrase preaching to the choir is such a negative phrase. And I was like, people come to the church for the preaching, the singing, and the hanging out on the church steps. Language does so many other things. And there's so many ways we connect that matter. And I felt like what I did with those young women, friends of mine in the same boat, was what we were just saying to each other as we told these endless stories about whether the boy liked us and how things were going south and how difficult our mothers were. And we're saying, I hear you, your feelings are legitimate, I value you, your perception of reality is legitimate, and you are entitled to it despite the fact that you're in a world full of people who want to tell you otherwise. And so I was living with those conversations in my most personal life with the people I had chosen as friends. And then in the professional world, I was dealing with a lot of different forms of misogyny. And also, and in my family and different ways in public life and stuff with people who are like, you're not qualified to speak. I don't care what you think. And of course, street harassment is about the experience of voicelessness. Your voice cannot set boundaries. I can say this stuff to you. And, if I can say smile and then threaten you if you don't obey me. I'm commanding obedience from a stranger. Or I can say something really nasty to you. And so often those guys would just default into rage that had a threat of violence, and was sometimes an explicit threat of violence or the violence itself. And just this sense that you are so voiceless, you cannot set your personal boundaries, and which is what rape is about, the denial of the voice that says no. And then the second wave that's so important, the voice that says, I don't believe you, you are not a credible witness to your own life, when you go say, I was raped, or I was threatened, or I was assaulted, or, or this is what happened. And that sense of constantly being subject to being overruled. So I was living this kind of binary, this sort of two-channel life, with the channel of support and solidarity from people who believed and who communicated and who we shared that reality with, and then the people who are like, you are not qualified to speak. And, so that was such my formative experience. And it feels so peculiar in retrospect to have set out to become a writer in a world where people were telling me I wasn't even competent to say what happened yesterday. That I was going to write history. But it was actually the writing of that history that gave me the confidence. I had these two really interesting encounters with men who did awful things and then told me they had not just done those things. When my fourth book had come out, my book Wanderlust, A History of Walking, I was almost 40, and it's kind of appalling to relate that this is how it happened, because I'd like to think I had inherent confidence and was fuck you all the way. But I was in my 40, I was getting close to 40, and I just thought, I am a writer of history. I am a person who has capably and professionally sorted data. I am not going to let you gaslight me out of what just happened, which was about the fact that I'd backed down so many times. And from Harvey Weinstein to the office creep, they all count on women backing down because they know Because when you're told a million times that you're not a credible witness, often you lose that faith in yourself. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. Do I actually trust myself, and is it worth it to come forward, and will I be punished for coming forward? And that creates the conditions for silencing that have been so powerful and creating an anti-democracy of voices. And I feel like what feminism is part of a larger human rights struggle to create, among other things, a democracy of voices. And yesterday, now, okay, because we're recording, last week, the two white supremacists who murdered a young black man who was just out running were finally arrested because enough people raised their voices in outrage. And they told this completely preposterous story full of racist cliches. And why did they murder him? Because they were confident they would get away with it. They were confident they were in a system where their story would be believed over even physical evidence and common sense. So somebody died of an inequality of voices, and and only because other people raised their voices and insisted on the new versions of reality we have, where a black man is allowed to go running empty-handed, unarmed in his own neighborhood, that maybe the story will have a different ending than the one they were counting on, which is that they would get away with it.
No, it's what as I'm listening to you, I was just thinking about how, so it's both about voice and then about credibility and then about people listening. And then I think there's this other layer that you get to, which is about what do you give yourself permission to say? I was reminded when I was reading your memoir of, did you ever read Joanna Russ's book, How to Suppress Women's Writing? She wrote it.
Oh my God, I need to.
Oh, I think you'll die when you read this, and because it's so, there's something about it that makes you feel for the first moment truly not gaslit, like somebody has turned off the gas. She writes about it at this one point, and I might get some of the details wrong, but she writes about being in a position as a professor at a literary fine arts program at a college. And she writes about the submissions process. And she says that, she was the lone female, and then there were 3 male professors, and the 4 of them together would decide who was going to, be given permission to join the program. And this story has stuck with me because she talked about how they would rank the submissions 1 through 25. And she said that she and her male cohorts would rank the submissions of the male writers the same. So who she ranked as the number 1 male writer, they ranked as the number 1. Her 2 was there too, on and on down the list, almost perfectly corresponding to, and of course the people on the top of the list, get into the program. With the female writers who had applied, their lists were almost the inverse. So who she read of the submissions and listed as the strongest female applicant, they ranked as 25. And who she ranked as number 2 that should get in, they ranked at the bottom of their list of 24, and on and on. It's a complete inverse list. And when I read this, it made so much sense to me, because she said, what I as a woman want to hear from other women, right? They were subject matters, they were styles of writing that were inherently feminine, and I was so excited to receive these new ideas, this new way of looking at things, this sort of paradigm shift. But a poem that I might read that a woman is writing about an experience in her kitchen where she takes a cabbage out of the refrigerator, and as she's peeling back the layers, she's thinking of her womb and her mother's womb and her grandmother's womb and the Russian doll of wombs, that to a male audience was completely uninteresting. And so the women who ended up getting into the program were the women who had changed their styles maybe, or who had absorbed more of the dominant culture and were reflecting it back to the male gatekeepers who were saying, like, yes, this story is permissible or credible or good. And I thought that there were moments in your memoir when you really touched on that idea of, like, you authorized yourself to insist on a form and a style and a way of thinking about things that was really different from other people. And in some ways, I would maybe describe as inherently feminine, like not necessarily logical or linear, sometimes elliptical and revisiting the same place, talking about fogs and moods and Yeah, so I wonder if you could speak to that at all. I guess how much of a struggle it is to give yourself permission to excavate those more unknown aspects of making art as a woman, like what comes internally, not what you absorb from the external world, and how you've been able to give yourself the permission to bring that out, even though you can meet with a lot of resistance for a really long time, and people still do. It's a tricky thing.
I think I benefited in a way from isolation, and I was a person with not many friends when I was really young. I was not good at connecting to other human beings. And in some ways, the isolation and the fact that what I wanted to do, which was essentially to be a kind of essayist, nonfiction writer, above and beyond journalism, at a time that nonfiction wasn't taken very seriously in the literary establishment, the fact that I was on the West Coast and didn't move to New York to be in the center of things, that I benefited in a way from benign neglect. I was a weed and not a hothouse orchid. And I worry sometimes both about the way that a lot of young people, particularly young women, live in this sort of constant bath of social media, where you constantly learn to present versions of yourself that will be validated and rewarded, whether it's looking pretty in a conventional way on Instagram or say agreeing with the group. I even think in writing programs about some of those workshoppy things where you get to hear what everybody else thinks. And there's just times where I'm really glad I didn't know what everybody else thought. I've had a few bad later in life workshoppy moments where I'm like, y'all don't understand what I'm trying to do, and it doesn't really matter because I don't actually need everyone's approval and permission to do it. So I think there was a real benefit to isolation in some ways. But as for the ellipticalness, the week after we lost two of the Bay Area's greatest poets, Yvonne Ballan, the Irish feminist and head of Stanford's writing program, who was a benefactor to me and a friend and somebody I admired immensely, and Michael McClure, the poet, often connected with the Beats, although he connects to so many other things, who was a beautiful human being and poet, and one of the few powerful, famous adult men who encouraged me when I was a young woman in my 20s and took me seriously. But I learned also a lot about writing nonfiction from reading poetry, which takes for granted, because that is the nature of contemporary poetry, the right to be elliptical, to make leaps, to suggest rather than comprehensively, definitively describe. But I think it was only in full-length work with Field Guide in 2005 that I gave myself the permission to follow a kind of poetic logic of intuitive, associative ideas rather than a linear narrative in a more logocentric way. And it was really interesting to do that. And it's one of several times where I went beyond what I had been doing before and didn't know whether, that book, I didn't know if I would finish it, if I would show it to anyone, when I showed it to people, whether I wanted to publish it, when I published it, whether anyone would read it. And it was also about the fact that sometimes you have to make art without an assumption that there's an audience for it. Because once you imagine an audience, you kind of imagine their implicit rules and what they're going to like and not like. Wow. And so I think that there was a kind of deep solitude that's hard to have now when we all want to check the internet every 39 seconds and, are constantly being course corrected by what other people think. And I just look now at how you write something and you can get all the likes and feedback, but you can also get the death threats on Twitter for dissenting. And, I almost feel like human beings when I was young, many of us, we were like wolverines or something. Wolverines are these solitary animals in the mountains that occasionally see each other and come together to mate, and then the females raise their young for a while since they are mammals. And now I feel like we're ants. We live in a nest and we kind of touch antennas to share information and have kind of group mind all the time. And I think that there's a kind of isolation that's really useful. And I'm happy now. I'm on chapter 7 of a book that only my editors and my wonderful agent, Frances Cody, and a few other human beings know about.
Wow.
And it's kind of great not having any feedback on it from anybody else and just being kind of alone with the material and my ideas about it. And God knows when it comes out. It's about, as some of my other books have been, things that might be considered masculine territory. Like when I did my book on Eadweard Muybridge, a lot of men assumed I'd gotten the technological history wrong. which is in Men Explain Things, because they didn't know what the hell they were talking about, but they assumed they did. So, but I kind of advise everyone to do that. Make sure part of your life is private. Part of your life is off limits from the feedback of every passing stranger and casual acquaintance. It's really important to not give a damn about what other people think about some of what you do, because they will approve what they know and are comfortable with. And that's not necessarily what you need and what we need. Mm. And so I think Solitude, I was lonely some of the time, but it was also my friend in a lot of ways. And in some ways it was reinforcing. So,
this makes me think of, there's a wonderful book that you did, the Atlas, Infinite City.
Yeah.
Looking at San Francisco. I was so moved by that book. And when we shot part 2 of the OA, Zal and I gave that book to many members of the crew as a way of getting to know the city. Because there are those fantastic maps that will show you where monarchs nest. And then on the next page, you're looking at the military-industrial complex and where's Bechtel and where are all the centers of the naval yards. And then it's exploring, all the women who did the work to protect the green spaces of San Francisco and how all these trees were protected. And it's such an interesting layered way of thinking about place as a kind of metaphysical concept. And when I hear you talking about isolation, I'm thinking of it again, because in the beginning of your memoir, you talk about that first apartment and also your first desk, and the idea that, like, I just get the sense that when you talk about those things, you're talking not just about geography, you're talking about some, I don't know, for lack of a better word, a spiritual sense of things absorbed, or that certain spaces can unlock something within you as an artist that might not be unlocked if you did not find that space. Or like the desk that your friend gifted you, you almost describe it as a kind of like haunted object that permeated your writing. And I just love that sense of things. Can you talk about how you developed it and how it has informed your work? Have you always had that kind of sense of place as porous and like interacting with your being and your mind? And
one of the funny things about the life I'm leading is that it doesn't feel like I actually grew up. Even before I learned how to read, I was passionately in love with 2 things, which was kind of landscape and place and the natural world on the one hand and stories on the other, and like nothing has changed at all. And and then also when I said I was solitary and lonely, I think I misspoke in a way, and I'm so glad you said what you did, because I want to go back and say, what were my most important friends in this period when I was 19 and I moved into that apartment that I would live in for 25 years? Of course, Mr. James V. Young, to whom the book is dedicated more than anyone else, my building manager, a black sharecropper son, World War II vet, who was also lovely to have in the narrative as the kind and protective man in a book that talked about so many men who were the opposite. But the apartment I moved into was, I was like a hermit crab in a chambered nautilus shell. It was such a beautiful little place. The city was my friend. The hills were my friend. Ocean Beach at the end of the city was my friend. And I still have such a strong sense that places, we always talk about how we love place, but I think if you can develop a deep relationship to a place through constancy, by attentiveness, by going to it again and again. And they reassure you, they ground you, your friends will die, but the mountains will outlive all of us. The river will outlive all of us. The ocean, no matter even what happens to the climate, the ocean will rise, but the tides and the sea will be there. I had a very difficult mother, and one day, and this is going to come out just after Mother's Day, one day looking at Ocean Beach, I just thought everything was my mother except my mother, that I was nurtured by books, that I was nurtured by the city, that I was nurtured by feminism, that I was nurtured by activism, that I was nurtured by, people I met. And most of all, I was nurtured by places, and by Ocean Beach in particular, which I still, maybe the most magic place in my life that I go to as often as I can. And so it's something I think there's a sense for people who don't spend a lot of time outdoors and don't spend a lot of time alone, that we are purely social animals and that everything we need must come from other human beings, which it generally doesn't. But if you recognize, for a lot of people, the love that comes from animals and the understanding and the kinship and all the other forms of connection, but also I think the membership that's not just being a member of a romantic relationship or a biological family or a small group of friends, but being a member of civil society, a member of movements, has also been really important to me. So I think as somebody who wasn't good at that kind of close to middle scale of conventional human relationship, family stuff, all these other things were. And so somebody said that the city is like a character in your book, which I loved. So when I wrote my history of walking, I looked at the male surrealists who described Paris as this kind of beautiful, seductive woman that was mysterious. In some ways they could literally enter her. In some ways she was always elusive. And of course, what is a gay man's or a straight woman's relationship to the city? What are these other places? And but I think that was a really important part of it. So thank you for bringing it up. And the atlas was also, I felt during the Bush era, as I do in this era, a kind of moral obligation to write about these public international issues of democracy, feminism, human rights, justice, rule of law, and of course climate change. The atlas came at the beginning of the Obama era, where I felt like I could come home again and localize again. And it was also a super gregarious project in a way no book I had done was before. The first atlas had more than 30 people working on it. And so I got to tap into people with skills I didn't, the cartographers, including Shazoo Segal and Benjamin Peace and Molly Roy, the designer, Leah Chandra, and all these people who had deep knowledge I didn't. And it was also, and this might be fun to just tap into while we're quarantined, how much there always is to know about a city, how in that surrealist sense, a city always contains more than we will ever know, how no two people live in the same city because there are so many versions of it going on, that the old Chinese immigrant woman lives in a different place than the young software engineer who was born in the suburbs nearby, how the gay man who's Black traverses the city in a different way than the straight woman who's white, how, the Latino immigrant kids often live in this kind of hyper-local, densely meaningful, territorial neighborhood, whereas a lot of other people kind of float through without ever knowing their neighbors or where the hell they are in any deep sense. And it's actually, I think it's one of the beautiful things about the OA is the sense of these really different characters with really different senses of their place in the world and the meaning and the things they're looking for, so that even as people might come together as a group in an intersectional way, they do it from really different needs and backgrounds and experiences. And just understanding that multifacetedness, I think, is so much what we've tried to do in this era of trying to let more voices in, listen more broadly, find what has been shut out and invited in. Have these braided and inclusive and multifocal narratives as opposed to the dominant hero narrative
Mm.
that is so violent and destructive, that Ursula K. Le Guin in her wonderful The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction compares to like a spear point you stab things with as masculine narrative versus the carrier bag narrative that is, a kind of a grab bag of many things. That might be another way to think about what you've done in the OA, and I've tried to do in some of these books with many other voices in them.
I love so much when you just described Ocean Beach as a mothering force, like the idea of finding in nature this other mother or this sense of nourishment, because I think that's happening for a lot of people right now. You have this wonderful metaphor at the end of the book about the Japanese practice of pouring liquid gold, lacquered gold, into the cracks of a broken pot, and that the gold actually adheres the pot back together, and so the cracks, the brokenness becomes a source of beauty. And it reminds me of that Leonard Cohen line, there's a crack in everything, and that is how the light gets in. And I've been thinking about that a lot, that metaphor of your book inside this pandemic and this experience, because of course it's revealing so much brokenness, and there's so much pain and loss and struggle. And yet I am also seeing these moments that feel like the liquid gold poured into the cracks. And one of those is the sense of a kind of return to nature, or as a source of nourishment. People tearing up their backyards and learning to grow vegetables and teaching their children and learning about companion planting, and realizing that nature actually isn't survival of the fittest at all. Nature is survival of the most cooperative. Like if you plant the right things together, the insects that one flower lures in will help, kill the caterpillars that are going to devour, your squash plant, and all the ways in which nature is so divinely interactive and ecosystems thriving in concert. And I've just been hearing a lot of things from different people trying this, trying to grow things, trying to get out in nature, finding the time or space to rescue a dog, and learning from that relationship how much we are, of course, animal, and like the dog is connected to the earth, and how these realizations and just the clean air we have right now in Los Angeles, and the dolphins that are jumping in the canals of Venice that nobody's seen for decades, there is some sense that perhaps we are allowing ourselves a little bit to reconnect with, as you so beautifully said, Ocean Beach or nature as the mother that we've been missing, that we have abused. And of course, then this just folds back into so many of the themes of your narrative about, our desire to annihilate the feminine, and how ultimately dangerous that is in the face of the climate crisis and everything else.
Oh, you've touched on so many interesting things in this moment. One of the things that came to mind is how many people are reporting hearing birdsong in ways they didn't before.
Yes.
And we are quieter now, that people aren't rushing around the way they usually are. There aren't so many airplanes overhead, etc. But it's interesting to think of how much it's that the birds were always there, but people are listening better than they were before. And that's so interesting, that kind of quality of stillness some people have in ways they didn't before, including me, I think including you, and what comes out of that. And one of the things I'm most committed to is climate activism and trying to address the climate crisis. And the stillness is about the fact so much of our carbon emissions are about production, consumption, and rushing around. And the fact that, you can see the Himalayas from northern Indian cities when they haven't been seen in decades from there is kind of amazing. The fact that air pollution from LA to New Delhi kills hundreds of thousands, or actually millions of people. I think it's about 8.8 million worldwide every year. The fact that, one of the things that's staggering for me, to talk about climate for a minute, is Two things. One of which is that fossil fuel, the Texas, I forget the exact term for it, Brent crude or something, hit negative $40 a barrel a couple weeks ago because demand is so far down. That is not anything I ever imagined I would see in my lifetime, negative $40 a barrel. The fossil fuel industry is really hard up in ways that we could really take advantage of. But that's, to make the climate transition we need to. But that's part of what's coming out of this. And by that, I don't mean to ignore all the suffering and loss and despair and financial freefall people are in. But you have to look, you have to grab the opportunities when they rise. The other thing that's happening that really matters for the climate movement and other economic changes for pursuing a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, maybe universal basic income, is that so many things we've been told for decades are impossible, which was always the argument why we can't address climate change. It's impossible to make those sweeping changes. We just made a bunch of sweeping changes. We threw $3 trillion out of thin air around. We stopped whole industries. We changed everything about how we live in a lot of ways. So that's part of what's happening that I think is really full of possibility, but also the way people have responded. As I was talking at the beginning with the anti-sewing squad and so many other forms of mutual aid, in a way, what the virus is telling us is that we're all connected. We are not separate. And there's much more pleasant ways to be told that, including just paying attention to science and the good as well as the destructive aspects, and science and nature and the world around us and the systems we're all part of, whether they're economic or social, or how ideas move from the margins to the center. And people you've never heard of formed your thinking. But, seeing how people... the kids next door are having a moment.
Excitement is happening next door.
Speaking of connected, my immigrant neighbors have made the loveliest sounds for the last 7 years I've been here. It was the sound of girls with the kind of hard heels tapping and swirling skirts, which wasn't much sound, but the heels were yesterday, and a boy playing a trumpet yesterday. But okay, it's subsiding, so I can think a little bit more about this. But I think also people are finding ways to connect, and that's been really extraordinary, and reaching out, feeling that deep sense of connection and empathy, and that's really important. All the people making masks, donating, supporting projects, just the fact that medical workers continue to go to work when it might mean their lives is such a profound and beautiful and amazing thing. It's not all volunteer work and donations. Sometimes it's people just doing what they already do. It's the kindness. It's people singing from their balconies in Italy and reciting poetry from their balconies in Iran. It's so many radical and creative reinventions of how we live and how we connect. And what's been really interesting about it is that connecting is sometimes seen as feminine, taking care is sometimes seen as feminine, just as recycling and caring about climate by men suffering from tragic masculinity have been seen as too feminine to do. Wearing masks has been seen as compromising masculinity, which is so outrageous, because what Asian culture, where masks have been used for a long time, has always been trying to tell us is this is not about protecting yourself, it's about protecting others. But I think that one of the tragedies of masculinity as configured in the Western world is that it is about isolation, it is about being shut off, it is about being separate, it is about individualism at its most deadened and miserable. And indeed, the capacity to harm someone is based on your lack of empathy for them, the fact that you've cut off the feeling that would naturally connect you to others. And how that plays out in this pandemic as we see wealthy people, women as well as men, decide that the deaths of others are an acceptable cost for profit and business as usual, and banal comforts like haircuts and manicures, is the other side of what we're seeing. And so we're seeing this incredible conversation through actions and choices and gestures about, are we all connected? Are we all in this together? Am I my brother's and sister's keeper, or am I all about myself and the infinite rights. I was telling someone last week that I grew up with a kind of American phrase. I don't know if it's liberal or conservative, but it was like, my right to swing my arm ends where your nose begins. Mm. And it was about the fact that there are limits on absolute freedom, even expressed in a kind of punchy way like that. And the argument we're getting from men with guns in the nation, the nation's state capitals and etc., is my right to swing my arm has no limits. To hell with your nose, and to hell with your vulnerability. To hell with not letting children starve. To hell with meeting the needs of others. To hell with protecting the vulnerable through our own decisions to stay at home, to wear masks, to be careful to wash our hands, something that's also turned out to be gendered for a lot of people. And so these questions about gender that I took up in the book have so many forms and permutations and tangents that are important to map. And of course, it's not all men. I know heroic gay doctors and male nurses and very good hand-washing men and male mask makers, etc. But the way that gender shapes our ideas of self and possibility and voice are, as do race, as do class, as do so many other things, are so important to consider when we look at anything. How writing and filmmaking have worked, but also how a pandemic plays out and whose decisions and needs are paramount. And, there's so many, it's an endless conversation. I don't know if we're coming to the end of ours at this point. I think we've been recording for about an hour. And,
should I slip in any of these questions for you, or
what about the ones for you? I'm wondering if you're any of yours you wanted to answer, or any for both of us you wanted to answer. Or...
some of these we actually did cover. Interesting.
That's kind of what I thought when I read them, is that a lot of them were implicit and explicit in the conversation.
Yeah, I guess a last question that I would have for you is, and you've touched on this some, I think of you as this exquisite collector of stories, not told or not heard, or misunderstood or undervalued, and also sometimes taking stories and being like, hey, what about looking at this myth from this perspective? And it completely gives the story new meaning. And I wonder in this moment of a pandemic, if you have been collecting any little stories, not unlike the one you told of the group of people making masks, that sort of point to hope in the rugged sense, hope in the earned sense, which you talk about in your book, Hope in the Dark, not hope as some sort of, I think that word has been misunderstood as somehow soft or silly or saccharine, but hope in this sense of something like sharper and more determined. Rawr. I just wonder if there, yes, hope, yes, I wonder if there are things that stories you've collected or observed during this period that have given you that sense. Any other things that we haven't touched on that you think might be heartening to people to hear in this time, since you are our great collector of stories?
Yeah, and I think that something that's worth saying, that's talked about in the memoir, talked about in almost all my books, is I feel like a lot of the job of storytellers is to say, who's not at the table, who hasn't been invited in, how do we invite them in? And, as a white woman, my job is to listen to non-white voices as well and try and pay attention to them and amplify them and get out of the way. And that means, for example, editing the first non-white majority volume of the Best American Essays last year. And it means listening to the stories of white supremacy after Hurricane Katrina for A Paradise Built in Hell and stuff like that. But for the hope side of things, which of course it has come from a lot of these places, Native American cultural and political revivals and resurgences, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who are immigrant farm workers in Florida, the Zapatistas more than almost anyone. And in this moment, actually with my friend Marina Citrin, a sociology professor, and Thelma Young, a climate activist in Fiji, who I mentioned before, we actually formally set out to try and collect a lot of stories of mutual aid, and Marina is collecting them from an anthology of stories around the world. I knew, because I have written about disasters before, that tons of it would happen, because it always does. But it's almost shocking how much there is, and how the very term mutual aid, which comes out of the anarchist book Peter Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, is now a really mainstream term. There's a website in the United Kingdom where you can see several hundred mutual aid groups around that country. Somebody complained about the redundancy of four mutual aid groups in Lexington, Kentucky, because people are also charting mutual aid in this country. And just to see all the people who form different kinds of mutual aid, from food delivery to the vulnerable, and advocacy, mask making, orchestrating PPE, interesting weird things like the factory workers who make the raw material for more professional grade masks. 40-something men shut themselves up for 28 days in the factory so they would not be infected or infectious or impacted by the pandemic. So they stayed for 28 days in their factory, eating and sleeping and working in 12-hour shifts around the clock to produce as much as they could. And, they were paid for that. But the generosity of that, the altruism of that, just the full awareness, we have something to give, and we will give as big and hard as we can in this moment, is so amazing, because the Trump administration is utterly corrupt and is sabotaging states' efforts to equip their medical and frontline workers and limit the reach of the pandemic. The governor of Massachusetts actually used the Patriots football team plane to fly direct to China and fill up with masks and fly back so that they couldn't be hijacked, as many others have. And a Buddhist group in Florida raised $500,000 to buy PPE for people in that area. I've seen $2.5 million raised for the Navajo Nation by what started out, I believe, as a small fundraiser aiming for $25,000. I'm just seeing really extraordinary stuff everywhere where people are saying, I see a need, I can invent a way to meet that need that will involve being connected to other people in ways we haven't connected before. We can form a new group, we can form a new coalition. And so not only is this meeting specific and tangible and, kind of rational needs, but I think it's also meeting a metaphysical need to be connected and to do meaningful work. One thing I learned in disasters is that the need to give, the need to respond out of empathy, compassion, a sense that we are not separate, is actually an urgent need. After 9/11, people went to blood banks and hospitals all over the country to give blood, which turned out not to be needed. But so much blood was given, if I remember correctly, it would have filled an Olympic swimming pool. And this desire to give from the most intimate thing you have, your heart's blood from your own body, is also happening now as blood is running short. I've been trying to figure out how to do it myself, but it's complicated here. And, but I'm just seeing so many interesting ways people are doing this stuff. And I'm also seeing politicians, the ones who are on our side, trying to prevent the corruption and respond to needs. People like Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker also trying to advance stuff. They just advanced a bill against large-scale factory farming. And so it feels like so many emergencies do, whether it's a war or a regional disaster, that almost everybody is trying to find their place, find out what they have to give and to give it. And just the generosity and the creativity and intensity is actually really hopeful. my understanding from writing A Paradise Built in Hell and Hope in the Dark and looking at these things very carefully is this is our true and authentic nature, and capitalism, among other things, has been a scheme for generations to turn us into lonely, selfish, miserable people, because that's what makes us good consumers, good and obedient parts of the machine of consumption and production and destruction and inequality that doesn't fulfill us, but we don't often see the other way. The best thing that comes out of disasters is this vision, this experience of connectedness, and this vision that everything can change for the better as well as the worse in moments like this. And some people always seize it and try and make something more lasting out of it. And the task facing us all in that moment is to do that. And so my hope has never been optimism, which is a passive belief that everything will be fine regardless. Nor has it, but it has been the antithesis of both optimism, which is passive and assumes we know what will happen, and the opposite of pessimism, which is gloom and doom and cynicism and posturing, because despair is a black leather jacket everyone looks good in. Hope is a frilly pink dress, as I would always say when I was talking about this book so much. Most people don't want to wear. Hope is a sense that the future is not yet written, that what we do will help write it, that there are incredible dangers, and that we need to never lose sight of the suffering and the destruction, but that there is room to address that suffering, and there is room for creation, and that's everybody's job, including our own. And that's the hope in everyday life, which is itself full of suffering and injustice, of hunger and exclusion and silencing and environmental destruction. And that's our job in this moment. And it's the most beautiful work we can do. And some people do it every day in their work as nurses, as preschool teachers, but I think people also do it as investigative journalists, as filmmakers, in so many things. And sometimes when people don't love what they have to do for a living, they find that they're doing it through their church, their mosque, their synagogue. They're doing it through their mutual aid group, their
sewing
co-op,
circle.
Their sewing circle, yeah. And
their gardening club,
yeah, their community. One of the things that was really exciting the last decade was in places like Detroit, all the urban gardening going on as a revolt against the food deserts and kind of nutritional inequality, that planting vegetables could be a revolutionary act of solidarity. But the planned, shutdown of the fossil fuel industry on a global scale to a local solar project, there is room for everyone. But what I also think shows up in this pandemic is that emotion is contagious, and you see acts of kindness, of encouragement, people putting things in their windows and chalking stuff on the sidewalk, that even those little things count as part of the effort. The applause for medical workers, that's become a really big deal in the UK and New York City. That we also influence people just by whether we rain on their parade or celebrate their capacity, which is so much what I think Recollections of My Existence was about, was trying to become one of those encouragers. And the writer Michael Sims has reminded me that the word encourage, which is often seen as a kind of sissy Pollyannish word that means being nice, actually means to instill courage. Courage, the quality that allows us to do what we believe should be done, that allows us to be who we want to be and need to be. And Brit, I think you yourself are a remarkable source of courage and encouragement in your work. I'm grateful we're friends. I'm grateful we talked. I'm grateful to City Arts and Lectures for bringing us together. And you should have the last word, but I want to just say one more thing, which is that I started telling fairy tales as a way to reach out first to the kids in my family and to anybody who wanted to be told a story in this crisis, because fairy tales are about relatively powerless, often neglected, abandoned, devalued people and how they find their way, their people, their power. But what was exciting about doing it was realizing here we are all alone in our houses, but if 100 people are listening, then the story is in 100 rooms. And if we're all in the same story, then we're in 100 rooms. We're in a palace of rooms beyond what we know and imagine. So I feel like having talks like this are ways that we join together in the big world. I suspect we're going to be in 1,000 words when this goes live in many rooms afterwards. I want to thank everyone in their room for being with us, for joining us in the roominess that is a story and a conversation, to thank you all for your own stories and conversations that get us through this. And thank you, Brit, so much for being a powerful teller of new and different and subversive stories. It's so great to be with you and so great to be with all of you. So great to be back with City Arts and Lectures in the metaphysical grand space of the Sydney Goldstein Theatre. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, and thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to do this with you and to giving all of us this memoir. I would encourage everybody who's listening to start with the memoir Recollections of My Nonexistence, but then to go back and read Hope in the Dark and read Men Explain Things to Me and read A Field Guide to Getting Lost. I reread that recently and allowed myself to wander out of my house and get lost in the city I thought I knew my way in, and it was a fantastic experience. Thank you to City Arts and Lectures, and also to Holly and Anne for helping organize this call, and the entire staff behind this experience that's keeping these conversations up and running when we need them in this time. Thanks, Rebecca, for this experience.
Thank you,
Miss
Brit.
you very much.
We'll be together on Ocean Beach before long, I hope.
One day soon, yes.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.